welcome to this edition of World Crisis Radio. And this is your host, Webster Tarpley, speaking from Washington, D.C. So today we have two principal unifying themes, I guess we can say, for our broadcast. And this is, of course, on the one hand, the beginning of the Trump presidency and the first week of activities connected to this, which is principally a matter of so much appointments. Maybe the appointments have largely been made, and some of these are now going through the Congress, right? Some of them have gone through. But this entire complex of the beginning of the Trump presidency and the inaugural address. And, of course, we can't forget the biggest single political protest in the history of the United States. And that was the Women's March. The Women's March, of course, much more than a women's march, but a turning point, I think, in modern history, the beginning of what I hope and believe will be the biggest single politicization of the American people in our history. And this, I think, is going to be a long-lasting tendency. In other words, years, decades of passivity, demoralization, are being thrown off every day like a cloak, and new vistas of activism are opening up. Now, of course, political education is needed, but we have to talk about the question of the mass strike, because the mass strike is now upon us, and this is much bigger than any president. This is a watershed in modern history. And from that point of view, it's magnificent. But the other side of it is the gaping lack of education, leadership, program, organization, all of the things that make political movements possible. All of this has yet to be provided. And that is where we aspire clearly to play a role. So this is one side, right? In other words, take the inauguration, take the Women's March, put that all together, and that's one thing. And then we have, on the other hand, we have the various policies that have now come in, right? And this, again, it particularly takes the form of these executive orders. We would like to compare some of this with the earlier examples. And one reason for this is obviously that January 30th, this coming Monday, January 30th, is, of course, the birthday of one of our greatest presidents, probably the greatest president of the 20th century, certainly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his first inaugural address, and some other handiwork of Franklin D. Roosevelt, such as the Atlantic Charter of August 1941, the democratic war aims, if you will, of the United States. And since the British signed on, it becomes willy-nilly, whether they like it or not, it becomes a war aims for the British, although they did not follow through. They actually repudiated it. Sir Winston Churchill repudiated these war aims. So the backward look at Franklin D. Roosevelt, and I just would mention, as we were talking about on the American system on Thursday, the 26th of January is also the birthday of General Douglas MacArthur. And there's a great deal to be celebrated there in terms of military leadership, but in particular, one of the greatest reform efforts of the modern world which were the reforms introduced by General MacArthur when he was the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan. He was SCAP, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. He was solely responsible. He made sure that there were no zones of occupation. He regarded the occupation zones as a terrible mistake, and when the British and the Soviets demanded occupation zones, the answer was no, that the U.S. was providing 75% of the effort and therefore did not intend to share this with people who had just entered the war in the Far East, like the Soviets, or had essentially been driven out of the Far East and were only then returning. So we have to talk about these things, and therefore the idea is we're in the 100 days of the new administration. So what should this look like, right? Taking the most successful example, which was Franklin D. Roosevelt, right? That's where this term comes from, at least in American history, the 100 days, right? There's another 100 days. We're not going to talk about the 100 days of Napoleon Bonaparte after he escaped from Elba and after he reproclaimed himself the emperor and then took his army out of France to Waterloo, Belgium, and got defeated and was then sent to the ends of the earth, St. Helena. That's also called the 100 days. We're going to hopefully leave that aside, although it may come back to haunt us. But the idea is to provide a means of comparing the Trump 100 days to something else. Now, let's talk, first of all, about the executive orders. I don't intend here to discuss the details of the speech, but maybe just a couple of things about the general tone of the speech. And I'm afraid the inaugural address is a document of significant pessimism, and therefore, in many ways, a break with the traditional American view of the world, right? All the cliches from the 19th century and the 20th century were that Americans were the most optimistic people. This was often paired with comparison, say, that Russians were pessimistic, but that Americans were optimistic. Fine, who knows what validity that has. But on the American side, it's for sure. The tradition is optimism, right? The spirit of the pioneers, the new frontier, and all of these things, right? Can do, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative. So optimism. This was simply not present. It was not a morning in America, but a midnight in America. And it was a world of drug gangs, crime, murder, essentially social chaos, decline, unemployment, and so forth. And obviously, these things have a definite empirical reality. They are there. They are real. They exist. But is that the purpose of an inaugural address, right? Inaugural address is not an analysis. It's not, taking a detailed look at a situation. It is to propose measures of action, as Roosevelt said in 1933. This country calls for action, and action now. So let's see what some of these things were in just a second. But it's pessimistic, and the other thing about it is the of any Soviet to opposition coming from a minority view. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and this is our post-inauguration program at the end of the first week, right? We're now, 6 or 7% finished with the 100 days, right? So we've got a sample that we can deal with. So let's see what we can survey. Once again, the inaugural address, I think, harsh, dark, midnight in America, and obviously addressed to his own supporters, not designed to allay the fears or otherwise reconcile the various groups that have felt persecuted by this campaign as it rolled along, and therefore I think not designed, really designed, and not likely to expand the base of support which is already there. And because of the poll results, right, we have to say that this base of support is somewhere in the area of 35 to 40%, and it has not increased. As a matter of fact, since a certain uptick after the election, it would seem to have, in effect, declined. So we'll compare that in just a couple of minutes to the Roosevelt 1933 and indeed the Obama 2009, because although we had one of the most successful 100 days are those of Roosevelt in 1933, we can also compare it to something a little bit closer to the average, which was Obama 2009, which was 100 days of certainly achievement, right? The stimulus. I think even the supplemental went through in those early 100 days of the Obama term, but it's not as distinguished, obviously, as Franklin D. Roosevelt. It lacks that heroic energy. In terms of the numbers, it's clear the numbers last Friday are something in the area of 300,000. The original estimates I had were between 250,000 and 400,000. So split the difference, you get 325,000. That's probably about right. And that compares with 1.8 million for Obama, Obama 1, 1.3 million for Lyndon B. Johnson, 0.9 million for Obama 2, 0.8 million for Clinton 1. That's one side of it. And then, of course, the protests, direct protests, 25,000 for Nixon, 20,000 for Bush, and there were also protests against Bush in 2001, right? The ones that Michael Moore showed you in I think Fahrenheit 451, if I'm not mistaken, or whatever it was, that movie that he made with the 451. All right, so let's just see. Coming off this, right? The pledge is the forgotten men and women. This is a term borrowed from Roosevelt. Roosevelt himself borrowed it from some previous speaker, but the popularity, the notoriety of the forgotten man, or as we should say today, forgotten people in the workforce and not, that is Franklin D. Roosevelt. So we're told, you will never be ignored again. Okay? That sounds good, but it does not exactly commit to anything specific. America first. Well, America first is a very dubious slogan. America first was launched by the unfortunate Colonel Charles Lindbergh especially in the time between June 1940, the fall of France, and December 1941, Pearl Harbor. There was a neutralist sentiment here in the United States. It's called the America First movement. These were the Roosevelt haters of the Liberty League and previous organizations. They hated Roosevelt for class reasons. These were the people who might have been interested in some attempt to eject FDR from the White House. He had, of course, undergone an assassination attempt in the transition between Hoover to Roosevelt, the one in which Mayor Chernak of Chicago was killed. That was in Florida. But Roosevelt had powerful enemies, and they reappeared in the guise of the America First movement. And this essentially was defeatist. It said that Nazi Germany is invincible. In particular, since it was Lindbergh, he kept harping on the idea that the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was invincible. And that was his line. So forget about resisting that. and stay out of it. Go to Fortress America, right? Fortress America, it was already impossible then, and we can imagine how impossible Fortress America, right? Festung America, how impossible that would be today. It's impossible. It's magical thinking. So forget about that. However, we have to remember the Hitler strategy was, you study World War I. What was the problem for Germany in World War I? Well, they had to confront, on the one hand, the French army in the West, the British Expeditionary Force was also there. There was a Belgian army, and so forth. So that was in the West. And then in the East, they had to confront the Russian forces, large land army. And the problem was that once the Schlieffen Plan had failed at the First Battle of the Marne, then the German position was strategically desperate. So the one insight that the Nazi government had, the National Socialists, was to say, you're going to have to go to war with all of your neighbors, but you can't do it all at once. You've got to do one after the other. So France first. Or actually the way they did it was, Norway first, then Denmark, then Belgium, Holland, then France, knocking these off one after the other. British left for a while, then Russia with the hope of going back. And eventually, once they could no longer do the seriatim approach, right? Once they could no longer do this one at a time, and when they were confronted by the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the British Empire at the same time, it collapsed. But the hope was always, up until, late 1941, to try to keep it one enemy at a time, one war at a time. And the Lindbergh strategy played directly into that. In other words, if the U.S. retreats into Fortress America, then the National Socialists in Berlin can simply continue that one-by-one strategy. So in that sense, to say America first harkens back to someone, a group of people who were, in a sense, essentially dupes of the National Socialists in Berlin. So this is not a glorious chapter, and really not worthy of being dredged up, because it didn't mean America first. In many ways, it meant America last, and hatred of Roosevelt first. Back in a minute. Welcome to World Crisis Radio. Webster Topley here in Washington, D.C. So this is our post-inauguration 7 days into the 100 days, right? 1/12 or thereabouts, almost a little bit more than 1/12 of the 100 days have now gone by, right? We can now draw certain conclusions. So I promise you, forgotten people, you'll never be neglected. You'll never be ignored again. America first, buy American, hire American, and so forth. But of course, this clashes. It jars with the negation of the minimum wage, a hostility to some unions, maybe not all at once, but to some at least. And let's go through a couple of executive orders. Hardly had the dust settled on the inaugural ceremony on the west front of the Capitol, then we had an executive order, and this is apparently the very first one, which governs, this is an executive order governing the interest rates on mortgages backed by the Federal Housing Administration. So this affects about 5 million U.S. homeowners, and the news for them is that their interest rate will go up by 0.25%. That is to say, they will be paying about $500 a year more on their home mortgage if issued by the FHA, and if they fall into this group, which is involved, they'll be paying $500 more per year. Now that ain't hay, is it? That sounds like, for some people that could be considered real money, right? If somebody said you owe $500, the answer to that would be ouch. So this was an emergency order. Let the word go forth from this time and place that the interest rates on FHA mortgages are going to go up by 0.25%. Now, was that part of the Republican platform? Was that discussed in the campaign, on the hustings, in the rallies, in the debates? I never heard it. I try to listen to as much of this stuff as I can. But this was the first thing. We also then had an executive order governing certain features of Obamacare. And I'm afraid this one tends to interfere, to introduce new elements of instability, which we did not need, into the Obamacare financing system. So this is just hours after the swearing-in ceremony. We have an executive order which instructs all federal agencies to, quote, waive, defer, and grant exemptions from or delay in any part of the law that imposes a financial or regulatory burden on those affected by it. This would cover consumers, doctors, hospitals, and other providers, as well as insurers and drug companies. This is the Washington Post here. So the drug companies, now what does that sound like? If I'm Big Pharma, can I come forward and say, I find this or that feature to be a burden, and therefore I want to be exempted? If I'm an insurance company, can I do the same thing? Say, this interferes with my business, and therefore I wish to be exempted. So we have Robert Lashevsky, president of Health Policy and Strategy Associates, calls this a bomb lobbed into the already shaky insurance market. And we have another expert, Teresa Miller, the insurance commissioner for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, said on the following day that it may lead to insurance companies dropping out during 2018 or even during 2017, and this would create a nightmare scenario, she says. And we find, for example, that as people should know, right, by now, Medicaid has merged in many ways with Obamacare, right, because of the Medicaid expansion built into the Obamacare law. And here we have people like the wonderful moderate, right, the hero of so many liberal, moderate Republicans, Kasich of Ohio. Kasich says he wants to limit Medicaid to people with incomes essentially below the poverty line, right? If you're below 100% of poverty level, then you can get Medicaid. Right now it's 138%. And what is poverty? Well, it's real poverty. For two people, it's approximately a $22,000 cutoff. In other words, if you're getting less than $22,000 a year for two people in the same house, that's poverty. So anybody above $22,000 would be cut off from Medicaid. They should go into the marketplace. The marketplace. Okay, so this is essentially the process of beginning to hollow out, to gut the law, even when no conceivable replacement has been proposed. Repeal and replace? No, it's not repeal and replace. It's repeal and head for the hills, right? Repeal and run. Or for us, it's going to be repeal and lament, or repeal and repent. So this is all going on. We also had an executive order saying that the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation is over. The U.S. will not participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, this is a little bit complicated. Trans-Pacific Partnership is bad, no good, right? Done in secret, done by lobbyists, right? Anti-worker, anti-people, anti-environment too. So something for everybody not to like. However, here's the idea. The economic part you can forget, but there was also the question with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. These were 12 countries that did not wish to fall into the orbit of China. That was one of the main things, was the economics, yes, but also the strategy, the geopolitics, the coalition building. So 12 countries, and in particular, Japan is apparently very shocked, very disappointed, right? Full of consternation that this TPP has simply been dumped. And the main thing is, there should be some kind of a replacement. What's the replacement? Isn't there some other form of cooperation, right? Has the human imagination become so impoverished that the only kind of cooperation that can be imagined is free trade or something calling itself free trade? It's ridiculous. How about a joint space program? How about a joint program of high energy physics leading to thermonuclear fusion power and then marketing that? How about the biomedical research, right? Let's find ways to cure diseases and make that the center of a new pharmaceutical industry. Aren't there things, a war on cancer right now in the short run, and aren't there things that could fill that gap? Because otherwise they're falling into the hands of China. The great beneficiary of that one, right? Getting rid of the TPP with no substitute, no replacement, no nothing, just no. Schluss, right? Close the door, slam the door. China triumphs. Here, another one where we see China triumphing, potentially this time, is the back and forth with Mexico. Now, the great whipping boy right now south of the border, and this is strategically, let's say, not wise, just not wise to alienate Mexico. You have a neighbor. You want good relations with your neighbor. It's called the good neighbor policy. Roosevelt coined that one. The good neighbor policy in the inaugural address 1933, but apparently not now. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Let me remind you, as you're undoubtedly concluding as you listen to this program, a lot of the analysis that I provide cannot be repeated here in a 2-hour weekly program, and therefore we have provided a daily program Monday through Thursday, 1 hour per day, which obviously has much more time to go into these things, and where we have focused on kind of a line-by-line analysis of the inaugural address and similar things. So for that, you've got to go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and there you can be getting this Monday through Thursday, and then this program on Saturday or any other day after that you wish during that week that it's, at the top of the queue. So I urge you to do that, right? You want to support my work. You want to keep up to date, be well informed. We're not fake news, right? We're not the establishment, to be sure, and we are not fake news. We are not the voice of any government at this point. We are the absolute idea in itself and for itself. That's at least the goal. China has had a great week. We're making China great again, right? One is that all the 12 countries, all those 12 countries in the Far East, including Japan, a big, important country. Man, you do not want to lose Japan on the basis of a temper tantrum or a fit of pique. It's wrong. That is really dumb. This is an extremely critical country. So the Chinese are now in the ascendancy in that sense. And now the news today is that, yesterday, it is that President Peña Nieto of Mexico will not come to Washington for the planned visit. And I must say, I saw Democratic Congressman Javier Becerra on TV, and he made a lot of sense in this way. He pointed out, if you insist on insulting and antagonizing Mexico, then you know who's going to show up on your southern doorstep? China. The Chinese communists will be there. And you'll be looking across the Rio Grande, such as it is, and you're going to find Beijing right there. They've already taken the Panama Canal. Why stop there? They can go further. So the amazing thing is all this sound and fury, all of this Sturm und Drang, all of this noise about making America great again turns out to redound to the benefit of rival countries. So that's the double. One part of it is in the bag, right? No TPP. And again, I'm against the TPP. TPP bad. But can't you come up with something that would replace that? Can't we have something that would be a form of international cooperation, again, in those areas of research, development, and then commercialization, right? Production, in order to fill the void. Because right now what you've left is a void in Asia. And this is unwise in the extreme. Now, one of the things that President Peña Nieto of Mexico, and again, this is somebody you really want to have reasonably happy. You want him on your side, right? To alienate and antagonize this person and this government is simply it's foolhardy. It's folly. It's incalculable folly. So this had come from an appearance at the Department of Health and Human Services, where an executive order was discussed, and this was that there will be a border wall built. It will be paid for by the U.S. No new money, however, here, right? This is not an appropriation. The money has not been authorized. It has not been appropriated, as far as I know, and therefore it is simply a promise, right, that it's going to be built. So a border wall, a physical barrier. And this is obsolete. It's always been obsolete. It's the wrong countermeasure, even in terms of the problem that they claim that they see. I mean, right now, there are more people leaving the U.S. across that border, right? People want to get out. And this, of course, a tragedy. I have to repeat my strategic premise again. The propensity of people around the world, young, energetic, intelligent, hardworking people, to come to the United States, to want to live here, to want to work here, to want to create their families here. That is the greatest single strategic advantage that we possess. Everybody else has a demographic crisis. The aging Japanese, the Russian population in decline. Maybe it's turned around, but until quite recently, in decline. The aging and pessimistic populations of Europe and China, having, within, again, incalculable folly, gone along with that one-child per family business, they have now got a severe demographic imbalance, and they will have demographic problems now for decades to come. The only country, the only large power center that escapes this tendency is the United States, and the Republican Party is working on destroying, dilapidating that one great advantage that we have. So there's going to be a border wall. We're going to have more ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's going to be tripled, I guess, on the border, or maybe in general. I don't know. He's going to hire a lot of cops. 5,000 more Border Patrol agents. The catch and release is over. These people will be held in prisons. So the prisons have to be either refurbished or expanded, and a lot of it is going to be the prison industrial complex, just what we needed. And to make sure that people don't come. And the ones that are here are going to be self-deported, right? They're going to be self-deporting themselves in the Romney terminology. It's a disaster. And look for people, say, in the Imperial Valley of California to start screaming, where's my labor force? And the same thing in these benighted southern states where they voted for a nativist, and then they didn't realize that he was going to visit upon them precisely some of the things that he said he would. There's also then the sanctuary cities. Let me just repeat this one. This will take us back to the situation that we had in a very dark chapter under the Fugitive Slave Law. You may remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the compromises of 1850. Lots of features there, but the main thing that interests us now is this idea that runaway slaves going up the Underground Railroad into the northern states, the non-slave states, the free states, let's call them, above the Mason-Dixon line, north of that. According to the Fugitive Slave Law, the governments of the states, right, had to essentially move heaven and earth to make sure that those slaves were caught and returned to their plantations and the people who claimed to be the owners. And a lot of people said no, and in particular in Massachusetts, where abolitionism was on the rise, people said no, we're going to pass personal liberty laws which negate that supposed commitment to send slaves back. And that's one of the things, that's one of the irritants that helped to set off the Civil War. So there we are again. We are expecting something about elections, right? It is a lot of people, I think a lot of these journalists are saying, well, the story that 3 to 500 million illegal voters voted, that is not just a subjective point of view. This is part of the plan. We'll discuss the plan here in just a minute. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C., and we are reviewing the first week of the new administration. I think we've touched on at least quite a few of the important executive orders. The underlying thing, of course, is very sinister. It is the idea that people are going to be stripped of their Obamacare. That's 22 million in the here and now, and then a potential expected over the next year or so that would have gotten it up to almost 30 million. And here's what it comes down to. If you're not a child, so if you're over 18, you can no longer participate in something called S-CHIP, the state-run child health insurance program, S-CHIP, or CHIP. This was Ted Kennedy and a couple of others got this going. It's a way, even if the family can't afford medical care, at least the child can get medical care. But this runs out when you're 18 or 21 or whatever it is. Then, from the time you're 18 to 21 to the time that you're 65, you have the following problem. If you lose your job, or if you are otherwise unable to maintain health insurance, and if your income is above 138% of poverty or something like that, call it 150% of poverty. In other words, if you're in the working poor, the lower middle class, into the middle class, depending on how many people in the family, if you lose that insurance, if you lose your job and if you lose the insurance, how do you get covered? How do you get the ability to go to a doctor? Losing your job becomes, essentially for many people, hell on earth. They're sick. They need care. They can't afford it. And the insurance company is going to go back to saying, sorry, pre-existing condition, tough luck for you. And what does that mean? You see these people, they're simply flabbergasted. How can you do this to me? And of course, this is barbarism. There's nobody in the advanced economic world. I hesitate to say industrial because it's not industrial anymore. And that's part of the problem, right? In order to have healthcare, you need an advanced industrial society, not a post-industrial service sector junk heap, moonscape, which is what we have. But still, in theory, you could still have everybody insured. But in order to do that, you've got to have a mechanism. Now, there are only two ways, right? One is by having Medicare for all, in which case you pay a premium and the rest is made up by a tax, hopefully on Wall Street, right? And fat cats, people like Goldman Sachs who don't pay taxes, people like General Electric who say, well, that they get more back than they put in, right? They have a negative tax rate, as we've often noted. That's one way, and the other way is the individual mandate, right? That everybody's supposed to buy insurance, including the young and the healthy, no matter what they think, and that way it can be financed for everybody. There is no other way. The high-risk pools are a cruel joke. Premiums are sky high, deductibles are sky high, and then there's a cap, right? So you're going to be paying $7,000 or $8,000 a year for the insurance, $25,000 deductible. You pay all that. Then there's what can we call it? A donut. Well, not even a donut, but there's from $25,000 to say $75,000. They'll pay, and after 75, you're on your own again. So this is impossible. You can't have a modern, high-quality labor force with this. If you do, they'll leave. They just won't stay. That's the other thing with these Republicans, right? They don't imagine that the world is big and that there are competitors who are ruthless and that they're stupid antics, right? The Republicans have the primacy of domestic politics. They want to have a low-wage, low-tax, Confederate-style economy, right? Backward, low technology, low wage, low tax, low technology. And that won't work, right? And you can't get people to come here at that rate. So they're destroying the greatest advantage that the United States still possesses. So that has to be opposed. Now, concerning the demonstrations, right, the Women's March, I would certainly, it included a women's march. There was a women's march going on, but I think the larger reality is this was a mass strike of the entire American people demanding basic rights, that health care is a right. The leadership of this was not capable of articulating a program or even specific demands. There was no platform, right? It was very vague. The people who did this, I think, were thoroughly overtaken, swamped, overwhelmed by events, overwhelmed by their own success. But the point about it is, if you look at the turnout, right, this was absolutely formidable. The estimated figure for Washington, D.C. is now 1.2 million, which is about 3 times or more the size of the inauguration the previous day. So 1.2 million Washington, D.C., 750,000 in Los Angeles, 400,000 in New York City, 250,000 in Chicago. Boston stood out with 175,000. And you can find this on you can actually go and get this on the AmericanSystem.tv page, right? We have a link to that. That is on Reddit, and there are 2 forms, right? One is the cities in the order of the size of the crowd, and the other one is a spreadsheet which has them all in alphabetical order. The total for the United States, I guess, U.S., continental U.S. and other, territories of U.S. is about 4.6 million people were out there demonstrating. And then the rest of the world, certainly Canada, very large results, and London, 100,000. So at least 400,000, maybe more by now, on the international page. So that's certainly it's the biggest mass rally or march or protest in U.S. history, I'm pretty sure. Bigger than Kent State and the Cambodian crisis of May 1970. Bigger than Occupy Wall Street. But like Occupy Wall Street, the big problem, there were no demands. This was the demonstration big enough to win a demand. And instead it had no demands, so it couldn't win any demands. And what could that demand have been? I think, given the stress on women's health, given the general composition, given the consciousness, the state of education among these people, I would suggest they could have understood a demand: save Obamacare. Don't destroy it. Now, naturally, as soon as we say this, this is not good enough. We want Medicare for all. I agree with all that. I want Medicare for all. I want it paid for by Wall Street through a Wall Street sales tax. But you got to realize, who were you dealing with, right? You were dealing with people who really had no demand, right? They would go down there and the signs were witty. The signs were interesting, original, but unfortunately they were going in 99 different directions. So politically it was not effective. And once again, save Obamacare, that would have been a gesture to a lot of blue-collar Appalachian types who right now are beginning to have buyer's remorse, right? In those hollers of West Virginia and Kentucky and in the coal fields, a lot of them are saying, oh my God, he really is going to do this, right? We really are going to lose our Obamacare, ACA, and there will be no replacement. And, as we saw in those Vox articles, right? The husband is sick. He needs the operation. Otherwise, it's curtains. And they don't have insurance now. So this is tragic. So that would have been a way to do it. Make sure the next demonstration you go to has a demand. Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And we'll be right back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now let's now that we've sampled some of the current issues, right? And we, of course, we want to urge everybody to take heart, take courage, be of good cheer, learn, if there's no other way, learn the pessimism of the intelligence, if that's what it looks like, but never neglect the optimism of the will. And remember that old adage, one of my favorites, taught to me by a coal miner of the Asturias of northern Spain: get active or get radioactive. And that can happen, right? We've heard threats about North Korea. We have heard there's a bill now coming from, I believe, Congressman Markey and, Senator Markey and Congressman Liu, who say that it's one thing to launch under attack. If you're under thermonuclear attack and you see the missiles and you're sure that's what they are, you can launch. You have to. But to do a first strike cold, no. You've got to get a congressional declaration of war. That's the Constitution, and that ought to be in a statute. And the genius of these two guys was that they did that when Hillary might have been the president. And if Hillary had been here, we would have needed it as much, just as much. So it's not directed against any person. It's designed to support the Constitution. But now let's just sample. We can get to some of the specifics of the Roosevelt 100 Days, but of course the beginning of it is the situation with the economics. So the first part, of course, the only thing. So let me just put it in this context. So first of all, says Franklin D. Roosevelt, March 4th, 1933. This is now on the east front of the Capitol. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And then he outlines the economic crisis. A host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally greater number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. Yet, our distress comes from no failure of substance, says Franklin D. Roosevelt, March 4th, 1933. We are stricken by no plague of locusts, compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered because they believed and were not afraid. We still have much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of supply. So who's responsible? Primarily, This is because rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure and have abdicated. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. And that's Wall Street, okay? Zombie bankers. True, they have tried, but their efforts have been cast in the pattern of an outworn tradition. Faced by a failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money, stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce our people to follow their false leadership. They have resorted to exhortations, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. This is the whole Hoover gang. They know only the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. The money changers, Wall Street, have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Hear that, libertarians? Social values. Yeah, there are some. There's something called justice, no matter what you think. So that's Roosevelt, right? The great task is to put people to work. And let me just find you the foreign policy part, because this would also get in and be quite relevant. In the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself, and because he does so, respects the rights of others, the neighbor who respects his obligations and respects the sanctity of his agreements in and with a world of neighbors. If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize that we have never, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other, that we cannot merely take, like Wall Street, but we must give as well. Remember, there are the makers, the takers, and then there are the fakers. And we'll see who falls into each basket. Okay, so that's essentially the flavor of the Franklin D. Roosevelt speech, inaugural address, 1933, March 4th. Now, on the night of Obama's first inaugural, right, there was this gathering in Arlington, Virginia. It's on the internet. I think you can find it on tarpley.net. I hope it's there. Where I did, the Roosevelt speech, where it is Wall Street and the money changers are they. What do we have here now? When Obama gets there, you're going to see how much the tone has changed, and it's a big step down. Although there are still some positive parts to it. So here we go. Barack H. Obama, January 21st, 2009, in Washington, D.C. So here's Obama. That we are in the midst of a crisis is now well understood. Our nation is at war against a far-reaching network of violence and hatred. We'll be right back with this in a minute. We want to provide the counterpoint, if you will, and then focus on some of the things in the Roosevelt. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're going to go on now to the Obama first inaugural. Remember a couple of things in terms of the executive orders, the ones that have not issued forth. DACA, the Dreamers. There's no executive order saying round up the Dreamers and deport them. That would blow up every campus. So if you had 4.6 million people in the streets last Saturday, you attack DACA, 750,000 kids, spread on all kinds of campuses. That's going to blow up the campuses. That will be bigger than Kent State, Cambodia, May 1970. There's also the one on moving the U.S. capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That will blow up the Middle East. And I think some governments have weighed in. I would suggest that King Abdullah of Jordan would be one of the biggest victims of that. We're told that Comey is going to stay, and otherwise that just rolls on. As soon as you hear anybody talking about high-risk pools, continuous coverage, premium support, voucherizing Medicare, run for your life, because those people are trying to strip you of your inherent economic rights. All right, now here we go with Obama. From the 21st of January 2009, we're in the midst of a crisis. Our economy is badly weakened, a consequence of greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but also our collective failure. Notice this, our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. Now, when you hear that from Obama, that meant entitlement cuts. And he had told the editorial board of the Washington Post the week before this that he was going to cut entitlements. And we had this live on. The chained CPI lived on until, I guess, 2 years ago. Obama was still talking about tampering with the already wretched cost of living escalator allowance that's built into Social Security. But this, again, with Roosevelt, it's they, the money changers, they, these masters of Wall Street and so forth, they have failed. They have failed with their own stubbornness and stupidity. But now we get our economy is weakened because some are greedy and irresponsible, but also our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. This is sort of the Peter Peterson point of view, right? That somehow deficits and entitlement spending are the cause, were the cause of the 2008-2009 world derivatives panic, when they obviously had nothing whatsoever to do with it. Homes have been lost, jobs have been shed, and businesses have been shuttered. Our health care is too costly. Our schools fail too many. Each day brings further evidence that the ways we use energy strengthen our adversaries and threaten our planet. These are the indications of crisis, subject to data and statistics. Less measurable but no less profound is a sapping of confidence across our land, a nagging fear that America's decline is inevitable and the next generation must lower its sights. So our collective failure to make hard choices, and again, it means entitlement cuts. I'm sorry, that's all it means. Social Security first, because that's easier, and then Medicare, because that's more intractable and complex. Okay? So, this is crazy stuff. But that was Obama, okay? But he did have a stimulus. He did have a supplemental. And, there were, you could get 99 weeks of unemployment benefits. You could get, various other food stamps were increased. Some of that has been cut back. But you get the idea, right? There was something. But now, right now, it is the repeal and replacement of Obamacare, but there's no replacement. And the Republican Party is structurally incapable, because their idea, if a Republican says a job program, and you say, well, what are you going to do that? Their answer is always what government should stop doing to let the wonder magic of the market, right? The invisible hand, the magic of the marketplace, to get out of the way and let that mysterious magical force take over, right? By the way, magical thinking is now everywhere, right? Just this expression, take the oil from Iraq. What does that mean? The oil is in the ground. It weighs millions of tons. How do you do that? You'd have to have a permanent enclave with a pipeline to some world ocean, right? And then you'd have to hold that against all comers for a period of decades. That's what that means. There would have been no end. There would have been endless war. And by the way, this talk is putting, I think the U.S. still has, 5 to 10,000 people, 5 to 10,000 soldiers in Iraq. They are in danger now because they can now be looked at as the leading edge of a force which is aiming ultimately at purloining the principal economic resource of the country. This is absolutely reckless and irresponsible. So let's now just look back, right, in terms of policy. What's with the Roosevelt 100 Days, right? One of the glorious episodes of our country. So it starts off with the fundamentals of the New Deal. Now I'm leaning here on a good old history textbook, Hicks and Mowry, Short History of American Democracy, Houghton Mifflin in Boston, a bunch of editions from 1943 to 1956. So this is the sort of the old school, but it's factual. It's got plenty of interesting stuff. So the three principles, the three R's: relief, recovery, reform. The 100 Days has to deal with these. Now, of course, you remember, as I wrote in my book I'm actually very proud of, right? The Surviving the Cataclysm. In Surviving the Cataclysm, you will find an account of this banking crisis, right? The banking crisis that was triggered by the British defaulting on gold payment in September of 1931, and that then set into motion a creeping banking crisis in late 31, 32, into the beginning of 1933, where essentially during the night, the last night between, before the noon transfer of power, right, from Herbert Hoover to Roosevelt. So in the last night of the Herbert Hoover presidency, every bank in the United States had shut down, right? New York closed, and then Illinois closed, and that was all of them. So when Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, despite what the libertarian praetors will try to tell you, every bank had already shut down. Roosevelt did not close any banks. They were already shut. And the idea was, if he called federal bank holiday, they would not be technically bankrupt, because if you were shut down as a bank during business hours on a normal business day, that meant you were insolvent and they'd come after you. So he said, no, it's going to be a bank holiday. So you can shut down and regroup, but not be declared bankrupt. And of course, then the method was triage. And we'll describe that triage here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So let's just remind ourselves of the terrible situation, March 3rd, March 4th, 1933, in the midst of this world banking crisis, when just about, every bank in the United States shut down. The governor of New York, Governor Herbert Lehman, at 2:30 a.m., signed an order, bank holiday in New York State. The Chicago people said, okay, in that case, we're throwing in the towel too. At 3:22 local time, Governor Horner of Illinois shut down those banks. So that was then left for Roosevelt to deal with. So on the day when he gave that speech, every bank was shut down. And it's interesting to note who had failed to open them up. The private sector, right? There was one called Bank with Hank, that Henry Ford was going to open up some banks in Illinois. Ford, Chrysler, Alfred P. Sloan all tried to open up their own banks. No private sector, no free market solution to the disintegration of the banking system. The Federal Reserve, under that leadership, had also failed. Private central banking, as exemplified by the Fed, was an accomplice in the collapse and in the disintegration. Some of the states tried to reopen their banks. No state was ever able to permanently reopen its banks. Congress, acting by itself before Roosevelt's inauguration, also failed. Federal agencies, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, was supposed to give loans, never succeeded in opening up the banks of any state, or indeed any banks to mention. The Herbert Hoover cabinet, acting under the free market theory, the business-friendly theory, also failed. And Hoover was good only, he could tell you theoretically why he couldn't do anything. So it was the activist presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt that allowed these things to be open. So what did they do? They triaged it, right, with the help of some people from the Hoover Treasury who were reasonable or had been shocked into some kind of realism. And they said, look, we got some banks can reopen immediately. Other banks are hopeless, and we're just going to shut them down permanently. They're gone. And then in the middle, there's the group that might respond to cash infusions. And one of the first laws of the New Deal was to increase the money supply so that there'd be plenty of green bills to hand out, right, to make sure that if there's a panic run on your bank, you can get some liquidity and, borrow it and go through this entire thing. Take a look at my book here on page 428, Surviving the Cataclysm. You find the status of each state on Inauguration Day, March 4th, and what it was in all the states, 48, and the District of Columbia. So this then leads to the Banking Act, right? So that's the Glass-Steagall law, although Glass-Steagall refers to a specific part. It was that the banks that were viable could open, and they were opening under the protection of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So you could confidently put your money into a bank now for the first time, and the federal government would stand ready to make sure that you got it. And the thing that Glass-Steagall, right, which we could very well renew, right, it won't solve everything, it'll solve a couple of things, to rigidly separate insurance from banking, commercial banking, from and savings banking and investment banking, right? So if you want to do stock speculation, that's got to be kept separate from deposits, savings deposits that are insured now by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So that's Glass-Steagall, and that came out relatively quickly. Now, the other thing, of course, was relief. Federal Emergency Relief Administration, May 12th, 1933. I think you're going to find that the 100 days go from March 4th of 1933, and they go all the way down to June 16th, I think is the ultimate yes. March 4th to June 16th. FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, CWA, Civil Works Administration, above all, FERA. This is Harry Hopkins. This is a genius of job creation. And this is where approximately, a significant budget is put out. And this is emergency federal relief so that people would not die. By the end of 1934, 1 out of 6 Americans in the population was benefiting from FERA and CWA. And of course, reactionaries come and say, that's a scandal. Everybody's on the dole. Yeah, because your free market theories, your impotence of Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, and above all, Andrew Mellon, who ran all of them, is responsible for these failed policies. Then we get the Civilian Conservation Corps, March 31st, 1933. Conservation camps provide work for unmarried young men between the ages of 18 and 25. Soon had 250,000 young kids under Army officers clearing forests, planting trees, improving roads, preventing floods, and performing equally useful tasks. And this is the one that contributed so much to what is called the shelter belt. If you don't like the climate, you better plant some trees. And this was one of the things that Roosevelt had understood very, very clearly. If you want to have cooler temperatures and more rain, then it's the shelter belt. And this planted, I think, billions of trees. And there's even a line, which you can still see today. Now, in terms of financing, this is one that gets neglected, right? Today, we always say we want to nationalize the Federal Reserve, right? We want to force the Federal Reserve by public law, as can be done and could be done any day by a law, or actually even by a presidential phone call, but we won't get into that right now. But the public law part, the Federal Reserve could put out the necessary $5 trillion for public works, for infrastructure, $5 trillion for that, and about $1.5 trillion to essentially neutralize the student debt problem by refinancing all that at 0% and letting people pay it off 1% a year, if at all, right? But it wouldn't be accruing any more interest. It would be out of the hands of private lenders who have been charging exorbitant rates. So here's the thing. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and this eventually it's associated with the name of Jesse Jones of Texas, who is a mixed bag, of course, but we can't have only angels running these agencies. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation had been created by Hoover as a bailout mechanism to bail out failing banks. But now we have, in the words of Mowry and Hicks, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had been established during Hoover's administration, was continued with the added function of lending to private industry, contractors, right, as well as to financial institutions, banks, but also railroads and public agencies. Now, this is not so far from what we're proposing. All such loans were on a strictly business basis with the expectation of repayment. Let's